Good morning, church family, and happy Sabbath. This week's offering goes towards local church budget. While some are still worshiping at home, you may return your tithe and offerings online at kytn.net. Now, I would like to direct your attention to the following video. Enjoy.
Hello.
Hey, Jackie.
Hey girl, what's up?
Nothing much. How are you?
I'm good. What did you think about the sermon this morning?
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about.
Oh, go for it.
What did the pastor mean when he mentioned about promise and promisers?
Well, promisers are those who have vowed to exercise their trust in the Lord by regularly returning to Him a percentage of their income as offering, in addition to the tithe.
But isn't the tithe enough?
Not really. According to Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 10, both are equally required by God, and the absence of one of them will configure dishonesty against Him.
Okay, but how are they different?
Well, the tithe has a specific percentage stipulated by God, 10%. On the other hand, He leaves it up to each of us individually to decide the percentage to be given as promise.
I see.
Another difference is that while the tithe must be used exclusively for supporting the authorized ministry, offerings should cover a wider range of other important necessities for the spreading of the gospel around the world.
Gotcha.
But why do you ask? Were you a little intrigued?
Well, no. It's just that sometimes I feel like God is calling me to take a step of faith, to become a promiser. And I think it will help me to be more consistent, giving offerings as regularly as God's blessings are and not according to my heart, or according to my sympathy, projects, or special calls. But every time He blesses.
I think you're on the right track.
Well, I must head out now, but I appreciate your explanation.
No problem, girl, anytime.
All right, bye.
Bye.
To become a promiser means to honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of your increase, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. Proverbs 3:9-10. As you follow God's word, let it be fulfilled in your life. May we put our desires last and God first.
O Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds Thy hands have made, I see the stars and I hear the rolling thunder. Thy power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to Thee. How great Thou art! How great Thou art! Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to Thee. How great Thou art! How great Thou art! When Christ shall come with shout of acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart. Then I shall bow in humble adoration, and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art.
Good morning, church. I am so excited to be with you this morning. And our message today is right out of Genesis, one of my favorite books of the Bible, The God Who Sees. I want to begin by just sharing with you a little bit about my family. I grew up in a family that I call the can-do family. There is just about nothing that my family believes that they cannot do. If something needs fixing, they're going to fix it. If they have to find something, they're going to find it. If they've got to go out and do something, they're going to do it. Whatever it takes, they can do it. In fact, my mother, who just recently passed away, just about 4 days before that, she called me and she said, "Gail, I can't figure out what that noise is in my house. And everybody's told me there's nothing there, it's not there." And she says, "But I hear that noise," and I went down into the crawl space with my flashlight, 90 years old. She could do it. She was going to take care of it. The problem is with a can-do attitude is that word faith kind of gets shoved to the side. Did you know that faith is not a noun? It's not something that you set on a shelf over here. It's not something that you write in a journal and say, "Lord, I want faith. I want this thing. Just put it in my hand, will you? So I have faith here." Faith is a verb. That means you have to do something with that. It has to be experienced. We have to work through faith. I want to share with you one of my favorite characters, and that's Abraham. I've been studying a lot about his life recently during this pandemic. And I'm just going to give you a little background before we get to the real meat of this story today. Genesis 12 begins the story of Abram, as he's called there. He's called to come out of the Ur of Chaldees. He's told that, "I'm going to show you where to go." God says, I'll just tell you. You leave and go. I'm going to show you. I mean, I think of this, I think, well, that'd be like getting in the car, getting your whole family, a truck behind you with all your stuff in it, and just driving. "Okay, Lord, you're going to have a sign. Somebody going to jump out on the road and say, 'Stop, stop.' You point that way. How will I know? What will I do?" But he had faith. Abram had faith, and he said, "I'll do it. I'm going to leave, and I'm going to go wherever you show me." Unfortunately, in that same chapter, there's a little incident there because there's a famine in the land where he's at. And without God's direction, he goes down to Egypt. He's afraid Sarai is going to, because she's so beautiful, Pharaoh's going to take her, and she's so beautiful that he's going to try to get rid of Abraham. Anyways, Abraham's faith that we see is so, by faith, Abraham in Hebrews 11, it failed him at that moment. The moment of his strongest, when he left the Ur of the Chaldees, he's so strong in faith, and man, he tanks it. It just goes down because he doesn't trust God with his beautiful wife and Pharaoh. And so I can imagine as they left Egypt that their heads were kind of down and that there was a lot of silence in that vehicle or whatever it was, camels, I don't know how they got back. But I want to make note of in chapter 13, it's really, really important that you see that where Abram went. Because it says Abram went back to where his tent had been and where the altar was. We can always go back to where we had that faith. Don't ever forget that. And that's what Abram did. He went back to the altar. He always had an altar. And in chapter 13, Lot comes into the picture, his nephew. Their servants, they start fighting, and the word that's used there is strife. There's strife. And Abram says, I don't like strife. I don't like conflict. He says, so I'll tell you what, you take this side or this side of the land that we've got here, and I'll just go to the other side. And I want to ask you something. Whose land was it? Who gave him that land? God gave Abram the land. It wasn't Lot's. But we have here a character comparison between these two men, because it says Lot did something interesting. He lifted up his eyes and he saw something that was beautiful. Oh, this land. It was like the Garden of Eden. That's how it's described. And yet, it was a city that was the most wicked city. He plants his tent there, and we know later on in the story of Abram and Lot that Lot is in the city, in Sodom. He leaves the tent behind, and Abram is still in his tent. Abram steps back. He lets somebody go before him, his nephew, and make the first choice. It's like when you're asked with a whole array of different pieces of cake that have been cut at a wedding or whatever. I don't know about you, but it's like, I hope I get the biggest piece, the one with the most frosting or not enough frosting or whatever it is you want. Don't we usually go for what we want, the best? I purchased a rug the other day that we needed, and I saw this rug. I thought, oh, it's just the right size. I've been looking and looking and looking, and I got this rug. And the man took it down. It had been hanging up, and he brought it to the front of the store. And as I'm purchasing it, a lady kind of walked behind me, and she pointed to the rug. She says, oh, that is the most beautiful rug. And I thought, oh, well, thank you. But I thought it's rolled up. So she must have seen it while it was still hanging and he was rolling it up. She left, and the man who had brought that rug up front says to me, she really loved that rug. She wanted me to let her buy it and tell you that it had already been sold and that I had forgotten that, or make up some story so that she could get that rug. Well, I'll tell you what, you know how I thought. I thought, well, I got the rug. I got the rug, and I am so glad that I got the rug before her. Interestingly, as I was studying for this sermon and looking again at Abram and looking at this where he stepped back, I thought, Gail, what would have happened if I had known that she wanted the rug that badly? I didn't know it at the time until the clerk there told me that. But what would have happened if I had stepped back by faith and said, you know what? You can have that rug. You can take that rug because God's bigger than any rug, and he's going to get me another one. It might even be a better one. I didn't have that opportunity, but that's the kind of faith in chapter 13 that we see. Chapter 14, we see that now Lot, because he's chosen Sodom, and there's this whole thing between 4 and 5 kings, and he's taken captive, and Abram has to go get him and rescues him with 318 servants. And then Abram has the most amazing encounter with the king/priest, King Melchizedek. And it is a type of Jesus. He gets to see who Jesus is. Has no mother, no father, no beginning, no ending. And we find that in Hebrews in the New Testament. But Abram, very first thing that he experienced, he stepped back in chapter 13. Chapter 14, he rescues his nephew, and he gets to see who Jesus is. And in chapter 15, as we move into that chapter, at the beginning there, he says, it says that the Lord appeared to him, and he was in a vision, and God says to him, "Don't be afraid, Abram, because I'm your shield. You're not going to have to fight. You can have enough faith that you don't even have to fight anymore. Just tell your servants to lay their weapons down. I'm going to be your shield." And then he says something so amazing. "I am your very great reward." Now, in the Hebrew language, I just want to tell you, Hebrew language is very, what's the word? Sparse. Can I use that word? I mean, it's just like to the point. Maybe you know some people. Now, I'm a sanguine. I use a lot of words, and you can tell I like to talk. But there are those who have very few words, and they just say what they need to say. That's what the Hebrew language is like. That's what the Old Testament has a lot of places like that. Very short, succinct, and to the point. That's why we want more of the story. But here, the author of Genesis says, God said to Abram, "I am your very great reward." Hyperbole. How much better can that be? God is again revealing who he is to Abram. You know, we all have a picture of God. And it's like this frame here. There's nothing in it. As you can see, it's blank. Because each of us have a different picture of God. And we've all been influenced by different things in our lives, by our experiences with God, by our answers to prayer, sermons, our parents, you name it. And we've put a lot of things into that picture that God has to sometimes clean out of there and show us who he really is. And that's what he was doing for Abram. That's why he called him out of the Ur of Chaldees. I got to take your picture that's over here, and I'm going to show you a whole new picture. You're not going to believe who I really am, Abram. And so in chapter 15, God comes back to Abram again. He reestablishes the covenant. He walks through these animals that have been sacrificed. They're cut in half. And God says, "I am going to do this. You are going to have land and descendants. You and Sarai, you're going to have a son." And now we come to chapter 16. How interesting that we see in this story that they have waited 10 long years. They're old. Abram's 85, Sarah's 75, and she's way past the age of even thinking of having a baby. In fact, ladies that are listening today, she was way past the hot flashes. She didn't even have any of those anymore. I mean, she was gone as far as having any baby. She was not in any position physically to have a baby. She was way beyond the age of having a child. But she had a handmaid, a slave. Now, some believe that she was a princess, maybe a daughter of Pharaoh, and she probably was given as a gift when Abram and Sarai's lie was exposed by God. Hagar is her name. It means flight. Now, she's this maidservant of who? Sarai, whose name, by the way, also means princess. So as our story begins in chapter 16, we have two princesses in the tents of Abram. Not looking real good. And when the main princess Sarai is barren in the desert, she just figures that she's going to help God with his promise. After all, it was his fault that her womb was closed to the seed. So she tells Abram, why don't you sleep with Hagar, the Egyptian servant of mine, and make her a wife? Let's read Genesis 16, verses 1 and 2. Begins this way. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, which, by the way, if you're familiar with all of the barren women in the Old and the New Testament, that was a mar against a woman. She was in disgrace because she couldn't bear any sons to her husband. But she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me, do you see who she's blaming there? Kind of interesting. From having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. I find this interesting here. Do you see what else it says there? Abram agreed to what Sarai said. We don't have any words of Abram. He doesn't say anything. I look at it like Adam and Eve when Eve brought the fruit to Adam. Not a word said. He's like, okay, I'll take it and eat it. Abram's like, oh, okay, I'll go over here and do that. Where's the man of faith? He knew what the promise was. He knew what the covenant was. Why did he do this? And there's no questions asked. Here he'd been so great before, and he falls again. It's amazing how, as David Asherick puts it, we are always trying to do for God what he said he would do for us. I want to ask you, have you ever done that? Have you ever tried to help God out? How did that come out for you? How did that work for you? You know, any attempt on my part to help God is a decision based on misinformation. It's that picture again. It's that picture that we don't have complete. And we think that because faith is a verb, we are going to do something now. We're not just going to believe and trust God. We're going to get out there and we're going to move and we're going to do. I'm just going to tell you, if you're ever tempted to help God, which we cannot do that, just go take a nap. Or bake something, or run a mile. Say, no, I'm going to step back. Because all you're going to produce is an Ishmael. So we know the rest of the story as it moves along here in Genesis 16. Hagar conceives and she becomes a wife, sort of. It's described here that she is a wife. And that was in the culture, that was very common then. If a handmaiden was given to the man of the house, so to speak, then she became a second wife. Now the first wife was always the one in charge. But Hagar conceives, and she is now a wife. So it's very interesting, isn't it? She was a princess, then she became a slave, and now she's a wife. But it says that she despised Sarai because now Hagar, with her belly out here, as she rubs her belly and pats her belly, walks in front of Sarai, she believes that she's carrying the promised one, the one that God told them in the covenant that he would produce through both of them. Both of them. And Hagar's really proud of that, and she's looking down at Sarai. Well, of course, that didn't set so well. So Sarai can't take it. She goes to Abram and she says, I'm not putting up with this. Says he slept with, let's go to Genesis 16:4. We do need to read that scripture. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. And when she knew she was pregnant, she began to, that word, despise her mistress. I don't know if you've ever been in that position where somebody looked down on you because they had something different or something that you wanted and you felt lower than they, or you felt disgraced and despised. Well, Sarai didn't take that so well. So she goes to Abram and she starts complaining to him. And I think it's interesting too that she actually kind of blames Abram. You slept with that woman. You went in with her. And there's a word that's used in there called embrace. You embraced her. It's kind of interesting. That word means that there was a little bit of feeling in there. She saw that closeness between these two. Because she's now, Hagar is carrying his promised son. And Sarai is jealous. and she realizes she made a mistake. It's interesting that because of that, then, we have Hagar who makes an exit. And this is probably one of the most important verses in this chapter, starting in verse 7, if you'll read with me there. Says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. Now I'm going to just stop right there because I want you to hear what that word found means. The word found in Hebrew means to find, to reach, and in fact, in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Old Testament that was translated into Greek, and the Greek word there means to find and to be held. He's found Hagar near a spring in the desert. And the other thing that the Hebrew word means, I love this, it not only means to find, but it describes the result following a time of searching. What does that mean? That means the angel of the Lord was looking for her. It makes me think of Luke 15. If you're familiar with that passage, 3 parables there. The shepherd who does what? He goes out and he searches for that sheep. What about the woman? She goes and she searches for that coin. She's going to do everything she can to find that coin. And the prodigal son, when he comes back, there's rejoicing. Here's the angel of the Lord who found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring on the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she answers, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. I find that interesting, that now she is a servant again. She's not a wife. She was a princess. She was a servant. She was a wife. And now she's a servant again. And even God tells her that she's the servant of Sarai. He calls her that. I find that fascinating that he put her in that position. But I want to tell you that word is interesting in the Hebrew because the root word behind that word servant means family. And that's important here in this story because God has come searching for her. Did you know that here is the first time that phrase, angel of the Lord, appears? I believe it's 40-some times in the Old Testament. But most theologians, and I believe that this was Jesus that showed up. He's the archangel. He's the angel over all the angels. And I believe that he saw Hagar and he says, I'm going down to her. I'm going down to her. And you know where she ended up there? She was by a well. I find that fascinating too, that a lot of women are found by a well. A lot of things happen by a well. Isn't that amazing? What an amazing God. And he asked this question, where did you come from and where are you going? Now, he knew where she came from. He knew where she was going. He didn't have to be told that. But he asked her that question. You know, I find in Luke 8:14 an amazing answer that Jesus gave to the Pharisees. They're after him. They're telling him that you don't have anybody to give a testimony about you. You see, you were supposed to have 2 witnesses to witness anything that you said about yourself or a story or anything that had happened. And they're looking at him, they're saying, you don't have any witnesses. Nobody is here to tell us that what you're saying is true. And he answers them with this. He says, I don't need any witnesses because I know where I came from and I know where I'm going. That's an answer for us. And he asked Hagar the same thing. Where did you come from, Hagar? And where do you think you're going? God to Adam, where are you, Adam? Remember that question? And she responds, I'm running away from my mistress. And what does he tell her to do? He says, go back to your mistress. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. What? Are you kidding me? Why doesn't he step in? This woman, none of this was her choice. She didn't ask to be a slave. She didn't ask to go sleep with Abram. She didn't ask to have a child. And here she is, a slave, a foreigner, a stranger, in the midst of a family who worship a God that she's not familiar with, not in her past, where she did come from originally. And here he's telling her, you have to go back. Why is that? I had to ask myself that question because I wanted to know, why would he send her back? Why would he tell her to go back into slavery with a mistress that, later on despises her now? And this is why I think he's telling her, because she was on her way to Egypt. Let's think about this a minute. She is a single, pregnant Egyptian with a baby of mixed race. And she's going to go back home, and she's hoping that her family is going to say, you're carrying the son of a shepherd. By the way, if you do any history with the Egyptians, they did not like shepherds. In fact, they didn't like anybody much at all except themselves. They thought they were superior. They had a great civilization. Everybody else was, kind of down there. So the result of her going back to Egypt probably would not have been a good one. But I think there's more going on here than that. He's telling her to go back to Abram and Sarai because where is the promise? Where is the covenant? It's with Abram and Sarai. It's not in Egypt. Now, God doesn't just give up on people who don't believe in him. Of course he was working in Egypt. But the knowledge and the promise were not in Egypt. The knowledge and the promise was with Abram and Sarai, as faulty as they were, with faith that was up and it was down, and it was up and it was down. But God says, Hagar, go back, because that's where you're going to have provision. And that's where your son, who is then predicted and prophesied to her that she would have this son, Ishmael. And that's where that son could sit at the feet of Abraham and learn about who God was. He would never learn that in Egypt. God is not there. He is where the promise and provision and knowledge is. So he says, that's where you're going to find me. I just love this. The angel of the Lord. It was a theophany. It was God coming down to his people. God is not a God that sits up there on his throne and just watches everything. In fact, I just picture, because I see this woman, and I know that there are those who are listening, have been in that place where you have sat and you have wept and you have cried because you don't know what to do and you don't know what's ahead of you. You don't really know where you're going. And there is nobody, you believe, that even cares. You just feel like you are all alone. And the Lord says, no, you're going to find me. I'm going to come down. I'm going to reveal myself to you. And I think that Jesus waited in heaven until he saw those tears and he said, I'm going down. I'm going to go down. I'm going to go down to this pregnant Egyptian slave woman and let her know that I am a God who sees. And when he came to her, he gives her the same promise that he gave to Abram. Your son is going to be great. You're going to have descendants. He's going to have 12 sons. And he tells her that you are going to call this young boy, this baby, Ishmael. Because just like Leah and Hannah and Naomi and all the women that the Lord was going to be in their lives, he heard her affliction. He heard her tears. And then we have the most amazing thing in this scripture. We have verse 13, Genesis 16, verse 13. When, after the promise is given to her, it says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. She couldn't believe it. Here was a God that she wasn't even sure about. She'd probably heard about him. She'd heard Abram talk about him and Sarai. She didn't know. She'd heard them pray. But here she recognizes, you are the God who sees me, and I have now seen the one who sees me. She not only names him first person and only person in the Bible to give God a name, El Roi. And she names the place there. And she says, now I have seen the one who sees me. She saw God. What do you think happened to her picture? She has the picture of Jesus now, and God as the one who sees. And by the way, the coolest thing is that later we read that Abram, when Ishmael was born, named him Ishmael. Abram wasn't given that name. Who was given that name? That came from Hagar. Hagar told her story. And Abram believed her story, believed she had seen God, and he names his son Ishmael, which means God hears. You see, God always sees and always hears. These names provide the message. Our son, when he was quite little, 7 years old, we received this little note. I don't know if you can see it, probably not real well, but it was just this little note. It was slipped underneath our bedroom door. Now, our son was relegated to his room that day because, well, at least for a period of time, I don't even remember what he'd done. He was probably 7 years old, and he had done something, and we said, okay, you're going to your room. So he was in his room. He crafted this little note and sent it to us, and I want you to, I'll read it to you here, but it has a little heart on the front, and it says, to Mom and Dad from DJ, that's our oldest son. Dear Mom and Dad, I love, he forgot the U, but he put, I love, exclamation points. And then down at the bottom, he puts, do you love me? Choose one. No or yes. Can you believe that? We looked at this and went, what? What? Do you love me? Choose one. And of course, you can see maybe here that we circled the yes. And then he says, return to DJ McKenzie, 2117 Grange Road, Buchanan, Michigan, 49107. P.S. Just slip under the door. And I laugh. I keep this in my Bible. Do you know why I keep it in my Bible? Because it is a reminder of every heart that cries out to God. Do you love me? Do you see me? Do you hear me? You know, one of the most amazing things in Galatians 3:8, go there if you can sometime. And I want you to read what's said there about Abraham. Because Paul writes that Abraham was given the gospel to be preached. He was to be a blessing to all nations. And guess what? The gospel is preached here in what Hagar says. You are the God who sees me and hears me. I don't know where you're at today. I don't know where your experience is with God. I don't know where your faith is. Because we all have those high moments and we have those low moments. And maybe through this pandemic, you've discovered that your faith has been challenged. But I want you to go back to this story. I want you to hear the cry of Hagar's heart. Because she did go back. She did go back. And God blessed her and blessed Ishmael. I am so grateful for the God who sees me. And I will tell you, when my faith is challenged, I go back to that altar. I go back to that place where my faith was the greatest. And I remember that he moved for me. He worked for me. He did for me what he said he would do. His promises are sure. So today, as we have worshiped together, as we've studied together, and we've seen that picture of God, just remember, he is the God who sees me and you, and he hears our affliction. Let's pray. Father in heaven, there are not enough words to describe what happened in this story. This woman is a foreigner. She's a slave. She's pregnant, not of her own choice. There's just so many things in here, Lord, that we would say, no, that's not a good story. That's not a nice story. That's not neat and tidy. That's messy. And there's some sin maybe in there. There's some reaching for doing it your own way, the can-do mentality. There's lack of faith, Lord. And yet, in the midst of all that, Jesus came down. Jesus came down and showed himself to a lonely Egyptian slave woman who was pregnant with a child of somebody that was not even really her husband. What a God you are that we worship today. Lord, may this give us faith. May we experience that same kind of faith that Abram did and Sarah, because in the end, Lord, Abraham did have great faith. We read of it in Hebrews. By faith, Abraham, and by faith, Sarah in her old age. They had their son Isaac, and what you did for them, Lord, could only be called a miracle. But your promises are sure for us today. So I just pray for each one listening, each one here today, that they will know you as Abraham and Sarah knew you too. Thank you. In Jesus' precious name we pray, King of Kings and Lord of Lords.